Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to my channel Philosmos, where everything philosophical is discussed. Now, today I will be talking about the observer effect. Now, if you're not familiar with that term, then I'd invite you to do a little bit of research into quantum physics, but let me just give you a brief explanation about what this observer effect means. Especially in the quantum world. Let's dive into what it means specifically in the quantum world first, and how this applies to your life. So the observer effect is actually the term given for the double slit experiment, the results of the double slit experiments, which found that the observation changes how the substance of matter behaves. So when it is not observed, it behaves like a wave. There are infinite possibilities. The particle can be both here, there, and simultaneously in different positions. But as soon as you make an observation, then the particle only has one location. It only exists in one space. Okay? But when you're not observing, it's existing in multiple areas. So the contingent belief, especially in the results of a lot of quantum physics experiments, is that they have no real life implications in our day-to-day world, in the classical world that we particularly live in. We think that the results or the conclusions gathered from the quantum world have no relevance in our world that we experience, the physical world that we experience concurrently. So I'd like to challenge this, and of course, there may be mistakes in this new paradigm that I'm going to provide, and I'm sure it may not be congruent with the normal scientific thinking. So I believe that the observer effect has real life implications. And it is something that maybe we have not necessarily paid attention to, but it's something directly observed in our day-to-day lives. Let me give you somewhat of a mediocre example, but it will illustrate the point. Pretend you are singing in the shower or singing in any environment where you want to sing out your lungs, So just imagine yourself singing your favorite song, singing that melody and enjoying it, right? And you're cognizant of the fact that you are alone, that you are singing in your own privacy with no one around, okay? And now take that situation and now compare it to you singing in a crowd, or coarsely singing with another person, another individual, with you, within your presence, observing you sing. Okay? Now, I can almost make the assertion, like 100%, be certain of the fact that your tone, your body language, and many other factors will be different when you sing alone compared to when you're singing with somebody else or other people observing you. We tend to change, we tend to modify our behavior based on whether or not we are being observed. So when we are being observed, our behavior changes in comparison to when we're not being observed. So this is the direct way in which we can see the observer effect having real life implications in our day-to-day existence. So it's not to say that only subatomic particles change when there's an observer. The physical world too changes based on the observer. So that is why it is so essential that we dive into what the observer is and the nature of the observer. Because if the observer can affect what it is observing, then we need to find out now and discover to what degree does the observer affect the observed. And once we then discover that, then we can reach new terrains in understanding our position in the universe. So we now must first define what an observer is. Okay, so an observer is a witness. An observer is something, an entity, whatever you want to call it, that is conscious, that is attentive, that sees, that perceives, that observes, that watches the occurrences that transpire in the physical world. And this observer in the human experience is not an observation that is pure. It's an observation that contains pre-existing ideas. So within these pre-existing ideas, it then now modulates and modifies how we observe, the position to which we observe, or the lens to which we observe. And based on that then now alters how the observed behaves when it is viewed from our observation. So if your observation contains pre-existing ideas about what is observed, then what is observed will present itself in that particular way. And that is why when we observe people that we have pre-existing beliefs about, then we automatically infer behaviors that may not necessarily have been the intention behind the people we are observing. So, for instance, if I observe the fact within my experience that people are selfish, and when I experience another person, then their behavior will be translated by that pre-existing idea. And even if that person's behavior is not congruent with my belief will superimpose itself on the observed, on the person, and thus that person's behavior will be observed in that manner. So ultimately speaking, we are observing a universe that is tailor-made for our pre-existing ideas. So that is why in the experiment, the double slit experiment, when the experimenter observed the particle, it became localized. It became one particular thing. But when it was not being observed, it was infinite possibility. So observation breaks down infinity into a finite experience. And the only way that it can do that is to superimpose finite ideas, is to superimpose pre-existing beliefs, so that what is infinite, what is essentially unknown, becomes known from what was known previously. So without the observer, there is pure infiniteness. And then the observer then collapses that infinitude into a finite experience. And the only way we can have a finite experience is to have a template of what experience is and what it entails. So the observer directly affects the observed by what it has observed in the past. So it is the past that is determining how these quantum waves collapse. And in what position that they collapse in? It's the past, it's our memory that is determining how these particles behave. So, for instance, if my observed memory is that every time I have to publicly speak, then I feel nervous, that will be my observed memory, and that will be what I observe in that particular moment. And that thing that is being observed, me doing the public speaking, will then be observed through that lens. And through that lens, then behaviors will be altered. Not only my behavior, but the people who are observing me speak publicly. Their behaviors will also be altered based upon how I observed that situation from the past. So it's our past that is influencing the observed. That is why in that experiment, when there was no observer, the particles went through both slits simultaneously, because there was no observer imposing memory, pre-existing ideas, and other beliefs that can then influence how those particles would behave. Those particles essentially behaved in a way that demonstrated that they were not being observed because they went through both slits simultaneously. But as soon as an observer came into the equation, then it only went through one slit. It only realized one possibility. And that possibility is congruent to the observer's experiences. It's congruent with the observer's pre-existing ideas. But when the observer is not observing, then the observed does not follow the pre-existing ideas and the pre-existing beliefs and the template to which the observer operates on. So matter itself has no particular behavior when it is isolated from the observer. So take this knowledge and extrapolate this into your life. That every time you observe, realize that you're observing from the lens of the past. And because you're observing from the lens of the past, from the lens of your memory, from the lens of your pre-existing ideas, thus you're modulating the observed based upon that. And then the observed will then now have a higher probability of presenting itself in the exact same way that is congruent with your already existing ideas as an observer. That is the power behind the observer. The observer collapses the wave function into a particular experience. In layman's terms, what that means is that you are creating the universe by merely observing it. So ensure that however you observe the universe, you observe in the position that brings you power, that produces love, and that gives you freedom. So thank you very much, guys, for listening to this. Please like if you really like this video. Please comment if you'd like to say something, and please share this content if you found it valuable. And to end it off, as I always end it off, but those who seek no more, for in the present we find it all. Thank you very much, guys.